Paul McCartney has carried this particular weight for 60 years, and it shows in the careful way he words things whenever the subject comes up, like a man who has rehearsed the diplomacy but never quite convinced himself it's enough. The grudge wasn't about money, wasn't about stolen credit, wasn't about a single betrayal he could point to and name. It was about watching the most important creative partnership of his life dissolve from the inside, pulled apart by a force he never anticipated and could never fully accept. The woman at the center of that story was Yoko Ono, and what happened between her and Paul McCartney across 6 decades of difficult coexistence is one of rock music's most complicated and least honestly told stories. James Paul McCartney arrived on June 18, 1942, at Walton Hospital in Liverpool, the firstborn of Mary Patricia Mohan, an Irish nurse who had trained at that very hospital, and Jim McCartney, a jazz-loving man who played in dance halls during the 1920s and treated an upright piano like permanent furniture. The family moved through several Liverpool addresses as circumstances shifted, eventually landing in a modest home in Allerton after Mary's midwifery income began outpacing Jim's work in cotton sales. She was the engine of the household, cycling through icy streets at 3 in the morning to deliver babies while her son slept, and Paul remembered those pre-dawn departures with a precision that only sharpens over decades. He passed his 11+ examination in 1953, one of just 3 children out of 90 to manage it, and earned a place at the Liverpool Institute Grammar School where, a year later, he met George Harrison on the bus, a slightly younger boy with the same consuming interest in music and a quietness that disguised how good he already was. On his 14th birthday, Jim gifted Paul a nickel-plated trumpet, but rock and roll was arriving through Radio Luxembourg and the trumpet quickly lost the argument. He traded it for a 15-pound Zenith acoustic guitar, flipped the strings to play left-handed after studying a Slim Whitman poster, and had written his first song within months. Then Halloween night in 1956 ended everything familiar. Mary McCartney died from an embolism following breast cancer surgery, and the grief Paul carried from that night became foundational in ways he only understood later, most clearly when John Lennon, who lost his own mother Julia in a road accident in 1958, told Paul he understood exactly what that particular absence felt like from the inside. That shared wound became one of the deepest and least spoken bonds between them. On July 6, 1957, Paul walked into a church hall in Woolton and found John Lennon on stage with his skiffle band, the Quarrymen. He was 16, loud and magnetic, and Paul watched carefully before they met. George Harrison followed into the group in 1958, Stuart Sutcliffe joined as bassist and then stepped away in 1961, and Pete Best signed on as drummer just before Hamburg. That residency in Germany changed everything. The gigs ran past midnight into early morning. The crowds demanded relentlessness, and the band that returned to Liverpool was sharpened into something the British music scene had not quite encountered before. Brian Epstein, a record store owner who caught them in 1961, became their manager in January 1962, bringing structure to a band that had raw talent but no direction. Pete Best departed in August. Ringo Starr arrived, Love Me Do hit airwaves in October, and by 1963, the Beatles were the defining cultural fact in Britain. America fell in February 1964 when the band landed in New York City for the Ed Sullivan Show, and Beatlemania crossed the Atlantic with a force that permanently altered the physics of celebrity. The Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership, already producing She Loves You, I Wanna Hold Your Hand, and Can't Buy Me Love, accelerated rather than slowed as fame grew. In August 1965, Paul recorded Yesterday using only his voice and a string quartet, the first Beatles track built around classical instrumentation, and the first completed entirely by one member, and it went on to become one of the most covered compositions in music history. Rubber Soul that year established Paul as the band's arranger and unofficial musical director. Revolver in 1966 went further, with Eleanor Rigby landing in territory critics struggled to label, and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967, largely Paul's concept, became the record that convinced people rock music could function as a serious and complete artistic statement. Paul later said the band wanted to be seen as artists, not boys, and Pepper proved the argument. Brian Epstein's death from an accidental overdose in August 1967 removed the one figure who had managed the band's competing personalities with anything resembling authority. Paul stepped into that vacuum and pushed the band toward Magical Mystery Tour, a film he largely directed himself that became the Beatles' first genuine critical failure. The White Album sessions in 1968 made things worse, with perfectionism, impatience, and rising personal distance turning the recording process into something exhausting for everyone involved. And that is when Yoko Ono moved into the studio and everything that had been manageable stopped pretending to be. Lennon had first encountered Ono at the Indica Gallery in London in November 1966, where she was showing conceptual art. Their relationship became public in 1968, and by the White Album sessions, she was present at every recording, sitting beside Lennon, speaking up, offering opinions, following him through a space that had always belonged strictly to the four of them. No wife, no girlfriend, no partner had ever been given that access before, and the breach registered immediately. Beatles historian Robert Rodriguez explained that Lennon was emotionally hollowed out during this period, still recovering from years of heavy drug use, from Epstein's death, from his disillusionment with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi following the band's India retreat. He wasn't looking for stability inside the Beatles anymore, Rodriguez said. He was looking for a way out of who he had been inside it, and Ono gave him exactly that. Paul himself, reflecting on the McCartney A Life in Lyrics podcast, described her appeal simply: she showed Lennon another way of being, and that proved irresistible to someone already leaving in spirit before he announced it formally. Rodriguez also noted that Paul had genuinely tried to make it work, bending backward toward accommodation that did not come naturally given how much was at stake. Ono reportedly brought a tape recorder into sessions and narrated her impressions of the band members. Her comment about Paul, that if he were a woman she would be jealous of him, exposed the shape of the competition underneath the surface friction. Rodriguez read it as evidence of a triangle, with Lennon at the center and Paul and Yoko each pulling at him from different directions, a dynamic that resolved, inevitably, in Ono's favor because Lennon chose it to. Paul had met actress Jane Asher in 1963, lived at her family's London home for years, and the songs born from their relationship, including And I Love Her, You Won't See Me, and Things We Said Today, remain some of his most emotionally exact work. Their engagement dissolved in 1968 when Jane discovered him with someone else and announced the breakup on a BBC program with a composure that Paul never disputed and never forgot. Linda Eastman, a photographer Paul first encountered backstage at a Georgie Fame concert in 1967, became his wife in March 1969, and the life that followed was the most stable he had known since his mother was alive. Linda learned keyboards at his encouragement, joined Wings through the 1970s, raised 4 children with Paul at their Scottish farmhouse, deliberately removed from the mechanisms of fame, and was, as Paul later said, a woman he counted himself genuinely lucky to have found. When she died of breast cancer in April 1998 at 56, the loss settled into him in a way he has never fully described and never needed to. The Beatles as a legal entity dissolved on January 9, 1975, years after Lennon had privately told the band he was leaving in September 1969, and Paul had made it public in April 1970. After Lennon's murder in New York City in December 1980, Paul and Yoko clashed publicly over songwriting credits, with Paul seeking to adjust certain Lennon-McCartney listings to McCartney-Lennon on compositions he felt reflected the true authorship. Ono's attorney argued that John was not present to agree to any such revision, and eventually Paul relented, leaving the original credit as the permanent record of what he and John had built together. What happened after that was slower and quieter than anyone who had watched the earlier years would have predicted. David Sheff's 2025 biography Yoko documents genuine friendly visits between Paul and Yoko across the years, a warmth that gradually replaced what had been at best carefully civil tolerance. By the time Yoko reached her 80s, Paul described the relationship as real. He cleared her name publicly in 2012, and in a 2013 Rolling Stone interview called her badass, a word that, from a man who had once described her presence as workplace interference, covered an enormous amount of ground in a single syllable. The Beatles did not collapse because Yoko Ono walked into a recording studio. They collapsed because 4 men with incompatible visions, enormous creative egos, and no Brian Epstein to manage the distances between them had reached the end of what was possible between them. What Ono did was accelerate an ending that had already been written, and she did it not to destroy something but to save the man she loved from disappearing inside it. Paul McCartney understood that eventually. It just required 6 decades, more honesty than either of them had originally planned on offering, and the particular clarity that only seems to arrive when you have run out of time left to waste being careful.